Hi, is it on? Should be, yeah, sure. My name is Samantha Meles. I'm from the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, and I'm actually also involved as a PhD candidate, looking at also where disasters, social natural disasters and conflict collide in that sense, together in the project with Professor Dorothea Hilhorst. We are also looking at different countries, and even though we're looking more towards the response, DRR is obviously also a very important issue that comes up in our research as well. And the report was very useful, and I think it's a very great context and saying, okay, this is the state where we are at now, currently, and what are the current approaches that are taken. But if you were talking about what DRR actions are viable and appropriate for conflict settings, and also acknowledging that DRR is very political in any kind of action that we do, we are also really looking at the actors that are there, right? And I see the state also mentioned in the report, because most of the approaches are very state-centered. Also in the policies, they are very important. I see a lot of UN, I see a lot of INGOs, but I actually don't see a lot of local in the report coming up. And if we are talking about making DRR also parts of the humanitarian aid context more than the development context, then we also have the grand bargain, and we also have all the promises that we are actually going to go more local, and we're going to give more responsibility to the local actors, so either the NGOs, civil society organizations, and the communities themselves, because the communities are obviously the first DRR actors that are there. But I didn't see that coming up too much in the report now. So that kind of made me a little bit worried that we are, again, taking more of the top-down approach when we are talking about this very important topic. So I was just wondering, what is their role in all of this?
Thank you. The gentleman at the front here.
Thanks very much. My name is Ali Carnworth from Concern Worldwide. As Katie mentioned, we contributed some of our experiences to the paper, and we're delighted to be associated with it. Following on really from the last question, I suppose one of our key learnings from our experience of delivering DRR in fragile states is the importance of those local dynamics and the importance of understanding how conflict plays out at the local level and the way in which that interacts with other risks. And it was interesting to hear in the panel's discussion of the kind of disconnect between national level perception of conflicts and the lived experience. So, I mean, just in relation to the point that you made, Amjad, around the targetee of SFDRR and the national strategies on DRR, also, the importance of local strategies on DRR. And so it'd be interesting to get some reflections on how those national and local strategies need to interface to ensure that they're drawing up those local level experiences.
Thank you very much. Well, since you're there just next to you.
Thank you. Maggie Ibrahim with World Vision UK. I appreciate all of the panel's contributions. I wanted to just highlight as well some of the challenges that I've noted within our practice is quite similar to what Dr. Sadiq was saying in terms of capacity of actors to bring together the different disciplinary frames. So as a DRM expert, it's quite difficult to incorporate power analysis. And that is also true for our agencies, to bring together those two disciplines or the two approaches into a holistic way of working requires more than tools and approaches. It requires capacity building. It requires actually, space and time to get together to learn each other's approaches and work together, but also requires an engagement with communities that's very sensitive and empowering, which then also requires trust and relationship building, which then also then requires quite a commitment and time and empowerment agenda. So it's almost reformulating quite a lot of the approaches that agencies such as ourselves face when trying to do our best of empowerment and development under quite constrained conditions. So I'm very excited about this conversation. I've been working in this area for quite a while. What I would like to see is some of the conversation move around the systemic drivers that keep us having this conversation or mute us. So yes, that would be my plea. Thank you.
I've got a gentleman here, and then here, and then I think I'll come back to the panel. Oh, and I've got some online too.
Hi, my name is George Friedrich. I'm from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. I just have a question in relation to the civil society organizations on the ground. Well, evidently, many agencies operating there within conflict-affected areas are from the UN system or from the OECD member countries. And much aid is also coming from the OECD, so I'm wondering if that is actually a sustainable solution for the future, because most of the funding actually goes to the UN agencies or agencies from OECD member countries, and therefore leaving civil society organizations out of the picture when it comes to, you know, framing the models, conceptualizing the problems, and so on. So my question is, to what extent do you think that is sustainable for the long run?
Thanks, and gentleman here.
Richard Hughes from the International Council for Monuments and Sites and from ICOP, both of them representing various interests to UNESCO. Whether it's fortunate or not, my experience goes back to the 1980s from working in Pakistan and then subsequently in Syria and Yemen. The one thing that seems to me, from looking back over quite a long time, is the lack of continuity, whether it's at the community level or at the NGO level or at the government level, is that you go through training, practical workshops, capacity development, call you what you like, but there is a tendency for it to be a fashion of the time, and for us to find that all of these go round in circles and that you start having to reapply it as people move on, as they get new jobs, new positions, as money comes into the system and goes out at the system. And that continuity, I think, is absolutely critical, and providing a mechanism by which that can be achieved would be a major benefit to us.
Thank you very much. Let me come back to the panel. I'll go out for another round. I've got quite a lot of questions from the online audience, so try and be brief in your replies so we can take more questions afterwards. But there is quite a nice complementarity in the questions. Is really focusing on, you know, the local experience and, you know, the power dynamics and, you know, how people really are agents of this change. Aisha, maybe I'll start with you to answer some of these questions, because you spend so much time trying to analyze that.
Thank you. I think you're right. A lot of these questions kind of really are on point with particularly the kind of local dynamics and power struggles on the ground that you kind of experience that have very, very particular impacts. But I just kind of, for a moment, want to say something slightly controversial, which is that I don't think it's helpful to romanticize the local, right? Because again, I've come out of spending all this time at the community level, and when you ask, for example, at a barangay, which is like a small barrio, maybe 100 households, 200 households, at that level, so in the Philippines, they've done all of this kind of real local DRM teams and coming into offices for training and all of this. And the barangay captain is like, I don't want all this responsibility. He's like, I've got enough going on when there's something like a typhoon. I need to evacuate my own family. I need to do, get my own house in order. And of course, this is in the immediate aftermath, and I am speaking perhaps a little bit more about response here. But then that feeds into the more longer term plans, right? So there is something around to be said around the tyranny of participation and kind of really insisting that everything has to be really local and really down to the individual who's also suffering. So I want to kind of challenge you there a little bit and say, are the people who are most affected necessarily the people who even want to be involved in DRR at that kind of level or in that kind of way? On kind of the disciplinary limitations and frustrations as well, I fully recognize that. I do something perhaps a bit more conceptual, where in academia I try and I look at geography or development and also at IR and security, and there's almost no way to make the two speak to each other. So I kind of fully recognize, but I think that it's got to start somewhere, So I think even having this kind of conversation, and we're doing a bit of work on a special issue on this subject, and we're trying to get a bit more impetus for some of the conceptual, the systemic, the structural issues to be studied, which is really at this stage what I would say would be the first step to try and overcome some of those. I have more points, but I'll stop there just in case others.
Okay, maybe I'll come to you, Katie, to complement what Aisha is saying, since you've also been analysing this in a similar way.
Yeah, I guess just to respond to the question here, I mean, I guess to alleviate some of your fears as to why there's not necessarily the local in the latest report, just to take a step back. Back in 2013, we produced a report called When Disasters and Conflicts Collide. And the original aim for that report was to try and just compile together everything we know about our learnt experience of how do you do disaster risk reduction in fragile and conflict-affected states. And so we tried to do that. And it was really through the process of that report that we realised that what evidence was out there was quite disparate, and it was fragmented, and it wasn't brought together in a way that was particularly useful. And so after that, very practically, we tried to sort of galvanise a bit of energy around it. We tried to get some funding to actually think about this more systematically. And it was really difficult. We got virtually no traction. So in 2016, we put together a very high-level report that just sort of said, here's some facts and figures about the evidence of disasters in fragile and conflict-affected states. And the idea was just to put together some sort of top-line statistics on why this is important as an issue. Again, really difficult. We got virtually no traction. And so this report, the Next Frontier report, it was really trying to understand why. If you present the evidence, and that's not influencing people's opinions, or it's not shaping the way that they make decisions about where they invest their money, what are these sticking points? What are the blockers? And so the report was really trying to understand, why is it we're just not moving forward? And that's why it was really focused on interviews with donors, with people that work in UN agencies, with international NGOs. It was very much focused at a certain sort of layer of people that are deeply engaged in making decisions around financing for disaster risk reduction, particularly through overseas development assistance. The people that are involved in these regional and international discussions, it was focused at them quite intentionally. But through that report, it revealed a number of assumptions, and there's just one that I want to point out, which is there was an assumption, and certainly it's the case at the moment, that the international system and this sort of the normative vision of what we consider to be an effective DRR system, it's predicated around this idea of a nation state. And that's actually quite limiting. And it's limiting because most people's lived realities of risk, as we've been hearing, they're complex, they're informal, and they're uncertain. And actually there's a disparity between, on the one hand, these sort of formal international structures where there's virtually no recognition of conflict, and then you do have very grounded community-based DRR, but there's nothing in between. And so I think we sort of keep coming back to this problem where at the moment we need to challenge ourselves on the systems that we have at the moment, and are they reflecting and supporting people that are most vulnerable to disasters?
Amjad, there was a question on the conceptualization and the funding of these issues really being concentrated on UN agencies, OECD types of organization. How do you see that? I mean, how do you see a role, not just for the communities, but also for civil society in these countries?
No, I don't know if that's true. I don't know if there's more funding going to this group rather than that group. I think if you look at the combination of a whole, it's difficult to say for me right now. But I think the important thing, and I think the trend in the questions that have come up here is about the issue of communities. And my colleague over there from Concern was asking about local strategies and the importance of national strategies. We were speaking earlier about the issue of the role of communities. And I think this is a serious area where we need to consider when it comes to actually making DRR work in countries that are fragile and conflict affected. And so one of the things that we as UNSDR and with some of our partners are doing is we have this, the Resilient Cities campaign, which is basically focused on working with local governments, local communities. And it's very important. I found it, in my experience, quite successful in a number of countries. I think in Africa we have about 155 cities that are signed up to this campaign. And it involves strengthening local level risk knowledge. It involves ensuring that there's disaster risk reduction action plans. And more importantly, it helps us to circumvent some of the, well, not in a bad way, but what we're dealing with is a lot of centralized decision making in governments. A lot of times we're dealing with governments where the decision making is very much centralized. And as a result, you have a very difficult time reaching to the local level, reaching to the communities, because the centralized structure doesn't facilitate that. So this Resilient Cities campaign and the work we're doing in that particular area is allowing us to actually reach directly to the communities, strengthen their capacities, allow them to do more on disaster risk reduction. And this comes to the issue of national strategies and local strategies. The target E of the Sendai framework by 2020, it does include local strategies, not only national. So it's very important that that would probably work in countries with more that devolve powers to their districts, to their counties. I think the country I'm sitting in right now, in Kenya, it has a role that devolves a lot of the powers to the cities and local governments. So I'm hopeful and optimistic that that would be one way to succeed in promoting disaster risk reduction. Resilient Cities campaign that will help devolve some of these powers and equip these local governments to be able to take the process forward. Since these communities are they're the front line for disaster. They're the first responders and they're the first to be affected. So.
I'm sure you have a lot of comments on this particular sort of issue of the role of the communities, but there was also a comment about the lack of continuity in how we address these issues and the fashions that we constantly chase, in the aid world that we haven't addressed yet. So any comments on that?
Hello?
Yes. Did you hear my question?
Sorry, I'm so sorry. I thought you were talking to the audience. I'm so sorry.
No, I was coming to you to ask if you had any answer you want to offer to the audience, but also in particular the question we have not addressed, or the comment rather, about the lack of.
Thank you. It has been a bit difficult also to catch all the questions. However, some that I catch. The first things that I want to respond on the concern worldwide, and like sharing how challenging it is, how we actually, the DRR practitioners and the conflict, how they can interface, or maybe that was World Visions. But anyway, there are 3 steps. I just want to finally, there are 3 steps that I think that we can start doing even from now. I think enough evidence, enough experience. I think we need to start doing concrete actions. At GFDR, I just mentioned that we have this new initiative to bring together disaster and conflict expertise from across World Bank Group. And one of our critical steps that we are trying to do almost immediately is to incorporate our module on PDNA, post-disaster needs assessment, and to include conflict-sensitive training in that. So hopefully, once that's kick in, it would reduce the confusion on the ground. I'm not saying that it will create solutions to everything, but that would be our first step that we think would be great. And then I think we need to start having more joint training. Peace builders, DRR practitioners need to sit in the room together with similar case studies and then try to see how these different contexts can actually affect both parties. And then on the questions of civil society, I will have to disagree with Dr. Aisha. And that I do believe that it is super, super important to invest in local community. As I myself have been affected as a conflict as well as disasters now, practitioners on both topics. We are really welcome if more supports and investments done at the local level, because after all disasters happen, all NGOs, all international actors will leave us, and then that we, the local people, will remain there and will have to respond to day-to-day operations. I understand that after immediate disaster, then you get confused and all that. You will tend to think about your own family first and all that. But in the long run, issues cannot be solved within 6 months. It will stay with us. I think it is very key to invest in local community. At the World Bank, we are now starting to think how we can actually use what we call adaptive social protection. We are starting to actually look at existing social safety nets in fragile countries and how we can actually adapt that and to include disaster risk reduction in the existing social safety net. So that is our way to invest in the long term, so then people can actually respond to future shocks in the future without waiting for international actors to come in first. So those are just a few examples that we are trying to do. We are trying to be creative and try to tackle not only from the post-disaster or the after, but also on the ex-ante approaches, especially through the social protection aspect.
Great, thanks. Well, I've got loads of questions from the online audience, so I'll pick a few, and then I'll come for one, maybe 2 or 3 more from the audience, and we'll then have to conclude. So I've got a question from Lim Azulai, who was based in South Sudan until 2016. And the question is, by promoting DRR in conflict, are we reproducing silos? Wouldn't it be a better approach to build resilience to a number of risks simultaneously? We have a question from Tui Bing Nguyen, who is a DRR technical advisor with the French Red Cross. And the question is, how can we ensure the sustainability of DRR interventions as the state-centered approach may no longer work in this context? I think we have kind of addressed a little bit already. And then I'll take this one from Sabrina Stein, who is at the Social Science Research Council in New York, who asks, discussions of DRR in conflict and fragile states is often limited to the DRR community, while it is absent from peace and security discussions. How can these communities better engage together? Very good questions. And then I have a question from the gentleman here and the lady over there. I think we'll conclude. Oh, one more.
Yeah, thank you. Is that on? Yeah, some good questions there. So Marcus Oxley, and I would say I'm a resilience practitioner. I'm no longer with the Global Network, but I was in a workshop in Beirut in the Middle East in February with the Red Cross, Red Crescent societies, and they were talking about the challenge of providing humanitarian assistance in the Yemen and in Syria, and in those conflict-affected areas. And they were posing the question that can we afford to support community resilience in fragile and conflict-affected contexts? and discussions around that. And the starting point, really, I think, is in these conflict-affected areas, is we should be trying to understand how do affected populations survive and endure and sustain themselves under these extreme shocks and stresses. Because although we kind of often think, well, it's the external agencies that are playing a significant role here, in the majority of cases, it's local people, whether they want to or not, have no option, but they have to survive and they have to endure. And the way they do that is they build on their local and innate sources of resilience. They collaborate, they cooperate, they mobilize, they connect. You know, they are not passive victims. They do this through, you know, through connecting with one another, through trying to understand how they can sustain functionality, how they can access medical services, how they can access water, how they can access food supplies. And the point is that anybody going into that dynamic to provide life-saving assistance, we should be trying to understand how we can augment and support and strengthen those local sources of resilience. And this, to me, is the counter of the fragile. If we are in fragile or conflict-affected areas, then how can we external actors go in there in the way that makes them more anti-fragile, more resilient? And to me, the key thing that really struck me is even in these really extreme situations, the way that people support one another gives people a sense of dignity, a sense of hope, a sense of purpose, a sense of solidarity. And if you come in with external life-saving support and without the thinking about what does dignity mean in that context, then you are really missing the point of what humanitarian assistance is trying to do in terms of assisting life with dignity. And so what I'm saying is that it's the way we design our humanitarian interventions should be looking to complement and support the resilience of the local community. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Last question was a lady over there.
Hi, my name's Lydia. I'm from Save the Children Norway. I'm hearing a lot about DRR policies, DRR frameworks, disaster management authorities, UNISDR, Sendai, etc. But I'm not hearing much about development and humanitarian structures, funding and things like that. I'm a bit concerned that we might go round in the same circle of DRR people talking to DRR people and not making those linkages. There's an awful lot that is being done in this space about linking conflict, linking development and working together. And I think there's a risk that we might miss that if we're not careful.
Very good point. And I have one last question I'm going to take from Amira from CIPRI, who asks, how can regional and national actors do better to support local governments? Local government actors often don't feel equipped that they have ownership over management plans. Very good questions overall. Before I turn to the audience, just to reassure Marcus, we are doing a long-term research project here with Humanitarian Policy Group, focus on the concept of dignity, try to understand in greater depth what dignified assistance is and how communities understand and live dignity and how they see our humanitarian interventions through that lens. So watch this space. It should come out by the end of the year, maybe mid next year. Great. So who wants to start? Some fantastic questions, I have to say, really, really good questions. Maybe, Rina, shall I start with you this time and then we conclude here?
Yes, thank you. So I think, fantastic questions. And then I think, Marcus, I cannot agree more. But then I think most of the time the problem now, I am one of the international actors. We always think about beneficiaries, others, like they. Well, actually, all of us can be one of those victims. So if we start actually changing our perspective that it's actually we're talking about us, I think a lot of it will affect how we do things. So that's one thing that. So I think I talk about the social protection aspect. Those are actually, again, key elements that I think can be tapped in the future that actually really bring dignity to the people whenever we're actually trying to respond from the humanitarian side. Local actors always your first responders. Life-saving, I myself, it's not Save the Children or UN who came and helped me after disasters. It's actually, they are my neighbors and local communities and the mosque and everybody. So there's no questions there. But then how we can actually bring all this together, again, it's time to unpack our political will. I think most of the time we are very reluctant to actually enter political discussions because we want to remain neutral as our institution. We don't want to take sides. But one thing's very important, the difference of disaster and conflict. The perpetrators are very different. In most cases, in disaster story, local governments are our best friend. It's less complicated. But in many conflict settings, local government can be the perpetrators. So I think it is important to understand that context, and then that's the reason why this issue is very complicated, because again, it's context-based, so we have to be able to understand who are the main actors and then try to be creative in finding different partners that we can work with. And then it's time for us to have a very frank discussion. If the governments are the perpetrators, what are our options? And then as the World Bank, for instance, our clients are the governments. So in most cases, it is very complicated for us to invest and to do things in the conflict setting and on disaster. So that's something that I don't think I can provide the answers right now here. I think that's the whole point why we are having this discussion, for us to bring together reality on the ground and to start unpacking this, because a lot to unpack and all the concerns that I have been hearing from the room. Exactly the concerns that I myself still have. So I will basically would love to listen also from other partners, non-World Bank, how actually what kind of concrete actions that they are planning to do next. Especially, hopefully, after this meeting, we will have something more concrete to bring together.
Jad, what concrete actions are you planning? And then address any questions you may.
I think, I mean, she mentioned something that's very, very important. I think I've always reading the ODR report and being a former humanitarian, or still are, I shouldn't say former, there was always a struggle not only between the humanitarian principles, the humanitarian agenda, vis-a-vis the political and security one, but there was also a struggle between the humanitarian agenda and the development agenda in some ways. And in many ways, actually. And I'm afraid DRR is closer to development than it is to the humanitarian. It's essentially a developmental issue. So what Rino was saying is true, is that we have to keep in mind that when we get into these conflict situations, and to some extent fragile situations, that the support we provide does not fuel the conflict further or fuel one party over another. So this is a very critical thing, and it's the elephant in the room that we need to keep an eye on. We are very similar to disaster, to development, and the one thing we do, we work with government, we strengthen their capacities, we train them, etc., etc. Now, you were asking about a good example of some. This comes back to some of the questions that you had on the Twitter, and the issue of sustainability of DRR, because that also comes into when it comes to conflict and fragile situation. The difficulties we have is once we invest, how do we sustain it? And that's it's probably more difficult in conflict situations than it is in fragile situations. But what we have learned in Africa, when it comes to disaster risk reduction, and this was a very quick and dirty study that we did, is that where DRR functions and responsibilities are placed in a country actually contribute to the success of DRR programs. So what we have found that in countries where DRR is placed at the highest level or highest possible level, let's say a prime minister's office, a president's office, a vice president's office, or within an executive type ministry like Ministry of Interior, we are able to succeed more. We are able to do more risk knowledge, we're able to be able to do more awareness, and we're able to develop, get more political mind. So this is something that we've noticed in the experience we've had, and it's very important for us to do it. I wanted to say something about how this links to how regional actors can support local actors, and the only way to really, one way to do it, not the only way, is to, within these regional gatherings, you have these member states coming around, and it's important that to ensure that we use our regional presence to make sure that we advocate with these member states to ensure that local actors are involved and engaged. So it's not so easy, and it's a long-term process, not very interesting, but it has to be done for us to succeed in disaster risk reduction.
Katie, there were a couple of really good questions about, well, first of all, these discussions is happening a lot in the DRR community, but not enough in the peace community, and then the colleague from SAFE saying, oh, we're doing, on the development humanitarian side, we've been talking about development humanitarian peace, how we bring together like on a daily basis, and now we've got the DRR sort of bubble as well. How do we make sure that we don't continue to really in many ways stick to silos that try and talk together by sort of staying in the silo?
Yeah. I think partly this relates to a comment that was made earlier. You could boil a lot of this down to simply know your context, understand your context properly, and we've been saying that for decades now, but there's still some fundamental barriers that mean that we're just, for whatever reasons, we're just not really doing that properly. And I think that I would always argue that, because I think it is still not the norm, for example. If you, for example, get funding for disaster risk reduction, it's not the norm that you have to demonstrate that you're doing a conflict analysis beforehand, or that you're applying conflict-sensitive approaches, or that you're applying do-no-harm tools. So there are some sort of basic things that I think we could do fairly quickly to improve the way that we understand our context. I think the other thing that came up quite a lot is this idea of resilience. I think resilience is great as sort of a top-line, universal, unifying concept, but as soon as you scratch below the surface a little bit, too many programs, initiatives, projects that are claiming to build resilience, actually, they tend to just then defer to one particular sector or issue or silo. So I think we need to be careful that we don't romanticize the idea of resilience. And I see this a lot, particularly where people refer to individuals that are affected by disasters that happen to have found the way to survive those disasters as being called resilient individuals. Simply surviving is not the same thing as being resilient. So I think we need to be a little bit careful about some of those terms. And I guess the final thing I would say, and I think this is sort of a thread that's come out quite a lot in the last set of questions, is this idea that we need to recognise that actually doing disaster risk reduction, it is political. The roots of disaster risk reduction are sort of much more in the natural sciences, but the reality is, if you're supporting some communities over others, if you're redistributing resources, whether it's knowledge, finance, protection, that is a political endeavour. And so actually I think we really need to just be a little bit more careful, and maybe even go back to the roots of disaster risk reduction theory to actually think a little bit more seriously about how, if disasters are actually constructed from very complex environments in which people live, then we also need to recognise that doing disaster risk reduction interventions are also political endeavours.
Thanks. Aisha, the final comments to you. Bring us back to that lived experience you talked about.
Yeah, I think a lot of these strands kind of can get connected through that very local aspect. And just to clarify, when I say that we need to really kind of challenge this idea of local community, I do anthropological work, and in no way am I suggesting that the community level needs to be ignored, but rather, or that they need to be kind of sidelined, but much more that we need to engage with what that really means, right? Our community's development has been saying this for 20 years now. Our community's one big happy clappy collective, or are there all of those kind of political tensions that Katie's just mentioned, and also what we had from Amira online, that in fact, do local communities communities feel fully supported, funded? Do they have the institutional? Because in the context that I have worked in, they don't have the basic. The municipal government does not know where the funding will come for the bus to take everyone to the workshop that they have to attend, right? So when you don't have those kinds of resources, is it fair to put more burden, more pressure to do stuff that they're not fully kind of trained and qualified, and neither have the financial resources to do? And kind of finally to really kind of put all of this in that sphere of people are really able to do much more than we give them credit for. And in this I don't just mean the individual or at the community at a very small scale level, but that I've done a lot of work on the post-flooding situation in Pakistan after the 2010 floods, and I really bang on about this a lot, so I didn't mention it today. But what the state did there, and this is in some ways a feel-good story, right? So what the state did there, because of the social registry, which I know in a Western context is very problematic to have people's ID numbers and citizenship numbers and all of that. But what happened there was that because they were able to use citizenship numbers and connect that to the post-disaster cash transfer that everyone received, I've argued quite a bit that this really strengthened citizenship in the region, that people were like, oh, because we're citizens, the state is reaching out to us in this kind of way with disaster response, with the cash transfer, also kind of linking back to social protection. And so people who had never really before felt like they were part of this wider state body, however problematic, and I agree with Katie, kind of taking that nation-state framework is, the fact that they were being reached out in this way, that it was connected to their under something they'd never felt before, to citizenship, the fact that it was universal and everyone received the cash transfer. There was just so much going on there and there was momentum there to kind of institutionalize it, to perhaps pass another kind of act in parliament to do something with it. And Pakistan kind of lost the moment with that and didn't take it anywhere, and it just remained kind of a one-time thing versus making it much more structured and institutional. But I think there is real possibility for strengthening citizenship, strengthening the state's relationship with people. That whole piece can really work in the ways that we're talking about.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. It's been an incredibly interesting, passionate, insightful discussion. I think we couldn't have hoped for a better start, to the work that we are embarking upon at ODI. I think the challenge, of course, is going to be to take this discussion beyond, if you want, preaching to the converted. I'm sure that a lot of the people that we have in this room and online are mainly DRR specialists who are convinced of the importance of this. So it's going to be incumbent on all of us to try and persuade our colleagues, to work with others, to work in communities that don't traditionally engage in this debate, and of course working, locally, deeply, in a very sort of informed and intelligent way to make sure that these things are seen, more holistically, and our analysis of risk really becomes, more complete. But we're looking forward, to this work. Remain engaged, contribute. But for the time being, please join me in thanking the panel very much for this discussion.